This is Gary Stieber with a message from Matthew chapter 14, verses 22 through 33. Our passage covers the familiar story of Jesus walking on the water and calling Peter to do the same. Jesus didn't walk on the water because it was the shortest distance between points A and B, or simply to prove that he could. There are many things he wants to teach the disciples and us. This story is rich in Old Testament references and symbolism, and all of it points to Jesus as the Messiah, the Son of God, and God in human flesh. Now, I'd like to remind you that if you follow the Explore the Bible study schedule, like we do, we give away our study materials free of charge. We publish every week, 7 to 10 days prior to the lesson's scheduled date, and if you'd like to get the complete study notes, along with the presentation to use as your needs require, click on the link in the description below and give us the email address you'd like to have notified. Each week we'll send you the link to the church website where you can download the materials. Now before we begin, let's set a little context, as we always do. This story is also found in Mark chapter 6 verses 45 through 52 and John chapter 6 verses 16 through 21. Matthew chapters 14 through 16 highlight the slow discovery of who Jesus really is by the disciples. He describes them as having little faith 3 times. And Jesus asked them, "Do you not yet perceive?" in chapter 16, verse 9. But by the end of chapter 16, Peter confesses Jesus as the Christ. So this is a period of great growth and learning for them. Now, prior to this story, Jesus fed the 5,000 by giving bread from heaven in a remote and lonely place. And that story is meant to remind us of Moses, whom God used in the giving of the manna. Moses later told the Israelites, "The Lord your God will raise up for you a prophet like me from among you, from your brothers. It is to him you shall listen." That's in Deuteronomy chapter 18, verse 15. And Jesus is establishing that he is the one Moses spoke of, and we'll see several comparisons to Moses in this story. And with that as background, we're going to pick it up starting at verse 22. Immediately he made the disciples get into the boat and go before him to the other side, while he dismissed the crowds. And after he had dismissed the crowds, he went up on the mountain by himself to pray. When evening came, he was there alone. Now from Mark and John's account, the route looks something like we see on the map here, from the shoreline someplace near Bethsaida to Capernaum. And the word "made" here means to compel strongly and implies urgency. And a sense of urgency is intensified by the additional word "immediately." Both Matthew and Mark use this strong language, and the explanation for it is given to us in John's parallel account. He said, "Perceiving then that they, the crowd, were about to come and take him by force to make him king, Jesus withdrew again to the mountain by himself." That's in John chapter 6, verse 15. The crowds had become so excited that they were about to start a political revolution against the Roman government and proclaim Jesus king. Well, this wasn't the plan. Jesus won't be made king now by the will of the crowd, but at another time by the will of the Father. So he acts quickly and forcefully to get the disciples on their way and disperses the crowd. Now, it's very likely that the disciples didn't want to leave him. Perhaps Jesus was forceful with the disciples because he didn't want them to get the wrong kind of idea about his kingship from the crowd. He may not have wanted the crowd to influence them into their plan, so he sent them away first. Now let me ask you a question. What are the weather conditions like at this time? Well, we're not told because they were unremarkable. They've had another in a long line of astonishing miracles in the feeding of the 5,000, but this is just an average day regarding the weather. Now, another reason that Jesus sent both the disciples and the crowds away was to have time alone for prayer, and that must have been hard for Jesus to get on a regular basis. Now, recall that Paul said, "Pray without ceasing" in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 17. And we should also get away alone to have a quality prayer time. We see that demonstrated here. Now, evening was a designation for the period before sunset. And notice the emphasis. We're told twice that Jesus was by himself alone. And we see 2 comparisons with Moses in this story. First, as Moses went up on Mount Sinai to commune with God, Jesus went up on the mountain here to do the same. And second, Moses oversaw a sea crossing, and Jesus will as well. Verse 24, but the boat by this time was a long way from the land, beaten by the waves, for the wind was against them. And recall, we weren't told that Jesus sent the disciples off in a boat on a stormy day. The weather was a non-factor at the beginning of this trip. Somewhere shortly after they got started, the wind became a strong deterrent. The word beaten here means to torment or torture. In describing the boat, it means to be tossed about or beaten by the waves. Now, the demon-possessed man in the Gerasenes used that same word. We're told, when he saw Jesus, he cried out and fell down before him and said with a loud voice, "What have you to do with me, Jesus, Son of the Most High God? I beg you, do not torment me." That was in Luke chapter 8, verse 28. The word torment is the same as the word beaten here. And Mark gives us an additional detail that Jesus saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them. That's in Mark chapter 6, verse 48. The word painfully means to drive or be driven. The clear meaning is the winds are driving the boat, but that word is also used speaking of a man in the Gerasenes being driven by demons in Luke chapter 8, verse 29. And so we see the sea is in chaos, like it was in the creation. So let me ask you a question. Why is it in chaos here? Well, because of the wind, which becomes a prominent feature in the story. So we see two words here that are associated with demonic activity. The disciples have seen Jesus cast demons out of people to restore their peace, and the language may suggest there is something spiritual going on. Now recall from the story of Job that Satan caused a great wind to come across the wilderness and struck the four corners of the house, and it fell upon the young people, and they are dead. That's in Job chapter 1, verse 19. It's at least possible we're seeing something like that here. Hold on to that point. Now, we often think of resistance in our lives as a sign of disobedience. The disciples are facing resistance from the storm because they are obedient. Jesus never promised us smooth sailing. Now, keep in mind that at least 4 of the disciples were professional fishermen on this body of water: Peter, his brother Andrew, and the brothers James and John. And their father was a fisherman, which meant they were raised from childhood to be fishermen. And their fishing business was in the spot they were trying to get to. And they also had hired servants in their fishing business. We're told that in Mark chapter 1, verse 20. The point is, they knew the sea. They knew the shoreline. They knew the common weather patterns and how to travel against the wind in all kinds of conditions. They knew how to instruct others on what needed to be done. They've been doing this their entire lives. Now, my wife Melba and I like to cook, and I watch a lot of cooking videos online. And I recently saw a professional chef in his restaurant making a specialty kind of sandwich, the first step of which was to toast the bread. So after describing a special sourdough bread as the perfect bread, he put it under the broiler to pre-toast it, and he burned it. Now, to his credit, he didn't edit that out. He left it in for everyone to see. There was no butter or oil applied to the bread. It was as simple as anything can be. Apply heat to the bread and warm it up. The point is that he failed at the most basic task. Let me ask you a question. What's the most basic task for fishermen? Getting in a boat and moving on the water. It's not a perfect analogy because the chef got distracted and failed a simple task that a child can do. The disciples are unable to do the most basic task that they've done thousands of times before. They are prevented by some kind of opposition. Now, I've shared this picture of the Sea of Galilee before. When Melba and I went to Israel several years ago, we were on the Sea of Galilee and took this picture while on a boat just like these. We were hundreds of yards from the shore, and the water couldn't have been any smoother. The picture on the title slide is the sunrise over the Sea of Galilee, and you saw the water was smooth at that time as well. While it was as smooth as any body of water that size could be on the days we were there, we know that God could stir up a storm more fierce than anyone could imagine to make a point that we would study for 2,000 years. And as we just saw, it's also possible Satan can stir up a storm to create opposition. Verse 25, "And in the fourth watch of the night he came to them, walking on the sea. But when the disciples saw him walking on the sea, they were terrified and said, 'It is a ghost,' and they cried out in fear." Now the night was divided into 4 periods. The first watch was roughly from 6 to 9 p.m., the second from 9 to midnight, and the third from midnight to 3 a.m. The fourth watch is between 3 and 6 a.m. This is a way of saying it was the darkest period before the morning came, which may describe a spiritual setting. They got into the boat before sunset, so they've been in the sea battling the storm all night, maybe from 6 to 10 hours or more. Now, John tells us they had rowed between 20 and 30 stadia. A stadion is equal to about 607 feet or 185 meters. It's slightly less than 1/8 of a mile. That would make this distance about 3 or 3.5 miles, or from 4.5 to 5.5 kilometers. Now, the he walking on the sea, of course, refers to Jesus. And the term when here describes both time and cause. They were afraid when they saw him and because they saw him. And at this moment, the disciples don't need Ghostbusters, they need Jesus, and he is now here. And notice we're told twice that he was walking on the sea for emphasis. Now, it's not known how they expected Jesus to meet them on the other side. They left him behind on the mountain, but nobody could have predicted this. They may have expected him to walk around the northern part of the lake, and at this point, the disciples probably wished they had walked rather than having gotten into a boat on the lake. Now, we're often afraid of things we think we see in the darkness. They are afraid of what they actually saw in the darkness, and crying out in fear is a reasonable reaction because nobody has ever seen anything like this before. This is the only use of the word ghost in the New Testament, both here and in Mark's parallel version. The Jews didn't believe in ghosts, so it's an indication of how frightening the sight was. They aren't sure what it is, but must have thought it was some unknown spiritual element. Hold on to that point. Now, let me ask you a question. Why did they not recognize Jesus? Well, it was very early in the morning, dark, and they were in the middle of a storm. The sea water is splashing and blowing, so visibility was bad. Second, what they saw made no sense to them. What they saw was impossible, so they had no perspective to rationalize what their eyes were telling them. And third, since it wasn't possible for a man to walk on the water, the question is, what on earth is it? Their thought may have been, maybe this is the end. Now, up to this point, they've seen Jesus heal every kind of disease and cast out every kind of demon, but this is something altogether different. Now, recall at the completion of creation, God said that man was to rule over everything, including the sea. We saw that in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. Here we see the one who does rule over the sea. Now, Mark adds an important detail to his account. He said, he saw that they were making headway painfully, for the wind was against them, and about the fourth watch of the night he came to them walking on the sea. He meant to pass by them, but when they saw him walking on the sea, they thought it was a ghost. That's in Mark chapter 6, verses 48 and 49. Did you catch it? Mark said he, Jesus, meant to pass by them. Now let me ask you a question. Why in the world would that be the case? And why did Mark record that detail? Now recall that Moses asked God to show him his glory in Exodus chapter 33, verses 12 through 23. And God agreed to do it and said, "While my glory passes by, I will put you in a cleft of the rock, and I will cover you with my hand until I have passed by." That's in verse 22. God uses the phrase to pass by 3 times in that story. Jesus is the rock of our salvation, and by God putting him in the rock, it illustrates that we have to be in Jesus to see the glory of God. And the phrase pass by is used to speak of God's presence, and it's used again in a similar way in Exodus chapter 34, verse 6, as the second set of tablets for the 10 Commandments is made. This is another way Jesus declares he is God. Now, Job described God by saying, Who alone stretched out the heavens and trampled the waves of the sea? That's in Job chapter 9, verse 8. Jesus walking on the sea is meant to remind us of creation, where God created and fashioned all of the natural elements. Only the creator of the sea can walk upon the sea, and, of course, those he calls to do the same, as we'll see in a moment. Jesus reassures them once again that he is God in human flesh. Now, a couple of verses later, still speaking of God, Job also said, "Behold, he passes by me, and I see him not. He moves on, but I do not perceive him. Behold, he snatches away, and who can turn him back? Who will say to him, 'What are you doing?'" That's in Job chapter 9, verses 11 and 12. Mark recorded that Jesus meant to pass by them as further proof that Jesus is God. Now, graciously, we see that Jesus didn't pass by them. He didn't just allow himself to be seen. He made it so they couldn't miss him, even though they were occupied with a mighty struggle. It illustrates 2 points. First, that nobody can know God unless he chooses to reveal himself to us. And second, that he wants to reveal himself to you. That point is further emphasized because Jesus reveals himself supernaturally, walking on the water. And even when the disciples saw him, they didn't immediately recognize him. Now notice also that phrase from Job, "He snatches away, who can turn him back?" We'll see a demonstration of that in a moment. Verse 27, "But immediately Jesus spoke to them, saying, 'Take heart, it is I, do not be afraid.'" The thing they feared the most turned out to be Jesus. Let me ask you a question. Can it be that way in your life as well sometimes? When we're in a struggle and the phone rings, or you see something in the mail that you think is about to be the final straw, sometimes it turns out to be something sent by God to provide comfort and relief. It happens all the time. Now, the word immediately stands out because they've been fighting the waves for many hours. And the phrase "take heart" here means to be of good courage or to be unafraid. It's the same thing he said to the woman who had the bleeding issue for 12 years. Now, John records the 7 "I am" statements of Jesus, and he uses those exact same words here in reverse order, which is why it is translated "it is I" instead of "I am," but it's the same words. So we could understand his statement as, "Take courage, I am." That phrase is a declaration of his being God. The Jewish culture of the day understood that. God said through the prophet, I am he who comforts you. That's in Isaiah chapter 51, verse 12. And speaking of Jesus, Paul said, "For in him all the fullness of God was pleased to dwell." That's in Colossians chapter 1, verse 19. Now, every time an angel appears to help someone in the Bible, they are startled beyond belief, which leads to the command, "Do not be afraid." It's sort of the common greeting of angels when they meet a person who is petrified. And we see the same thing here. He essentially said, choose courage, refuse fear, because God is here. The disciples were afraid there was some other spiritual element present, but Jesus declares he is God in their presence. And the story is building to a point that we'll see in a moment. Now let me ask you a question. When the disciples were struggling against the waves and Jesus was still on the mountain praying, could the disciples see Jesus? Well, no, of course not. But Jesus saw them. He knew where the boat was, and he knew their struggle. He knew when they were just about to run out of strength and energy, and he sees you in your struggle too. Now, Asaph described God's position with the Israelites moving through the Red Sea. He said, "Your way was through the sea, your path through the great waters, yet your footprints were unseen. You led your people like a flock by the hand of Moses and Aaron." That's in Psalm 77, verses 19 and 20. The elements of the creation and the Exodus stories are being retold in the person and work of Jesus in front of the disciples' eyes. Verse 28, "And Peter answered him, 'Lord, if it is you, command me to come to you on the water.' He said, 'Come.' So Peter got out of the boat and walked on the water and came to Jesus." Now, Matthew is the only one to record Peter getting out of the boat. I can't imagine Mark or John not recording it. Now, as is often the case in the New Testament, the word if can be understood as since, and I think that's the case here. Peter is saying, Lord, since it is you. Peter isn't looking for confirmation, he's looking for action. It's a great demonstration of faith. He fully believed it was possible. So Jesus identified himself, and Peter recognized his voice. Jesus said the sheep hear his voice and will follow because they know his voice. That's in John chapter 10, verses 3 and 4. So Peter isn't validating his identity. He's asking Jesus to share his ability with him, to empower him to do what he does, as he did when he sent the 12 disciples out and gave them power and authority to do all kinds of miracles. That's in Matthew chapter 10, verses 5 through 15. He asked Jesus to make me like you. And that's a great prayer for us, because we are to strive to be more Christ-like. Paul said, and we all, with unveiled face, beholding the glory of the Lord, are being transformed into the same image from one degree of glory to another. For this comes from the Lord, who is the Spirit. That's in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, verse 18. Paul said, him we proclaim, warning everyone and teaching everyone with all wisdom, that we may present everyone mature in Christ. For this I toil, struggling with all his energy, that he powerfully works within me. That's in Colossians chapter 1, verses 28 and 29. And that plays out in this story here. They proclaimed him, and then Peter stepped out in his energy and power. And Peter's response is just about as dramatic as Jesus walking the 3 miles or so from the shore. Now, Charles Spurgeon notes the humor in that Jesus would later change Simon's name to Peter, which means rock. Let me ask you a question. What happens to a rock in the water? Well, it, of course, sinks. And we even have an expression, it sinks like a rock. Now, Peter couldn't have known that at the time, but he made a bold request and demonstrated great faith. Now, let me ask you a question. What does Jesus' one-word reply mean? It's a very common word used over 600 times in the New Testament, to come. There's no hidden meaning. He commands movement, of course, to get out of the boat and come to me. But more than that, it certainly implies trust in me. Nobody could do what is being commanded here without the power of God, and he's calling him to have faith and trust in him. And that was a big part of the lesson in the feeding of the 5,000, which happened earlier in the day, that Jesus can be trusted for all things, great and small. And later, Jesus will call them to prepare for their death. He said, indeed, the hour is coming when whoever kills you will think he is offering service to God, and they will do these things because they have not known the Father nor me. But I have said these things to you, that when their hour comes, you may remember that I told them to you. That's in John chapter 16, verses 2 through 4. In either case, it's a command that carried with it the power of God over the natural elements. Just as Jesus fed 15 to 20,000 people with a boy's lunch, he does the impossible here. It's one thing for Jesus to walk on the water. He made the water. It's another thing altogether to extend that to a regular human being. And it's also remarkable that none of the others called out, "Me too." Verse 30, but when he saw the wind, he was afraid, and beginning to sink, he cried out, "Lord, save me." Now, we almost forget that the storm is still raging with all that is going on. We don't know how long the incredible moment lasted or how far he walked. And it probably wasn't long, but it was long enough to make an impact. Peter's wind-driven fear overcomes his faith. And notice that it isn't the water that frightened Peter, but the wind. He saw the wind. Now, what's odd about that is you can't see the wind. You can see the effects of the wind, but you cannot see the wind. The wind is mentioned 3 times in this story, and the word used here each time means a violent agitation. It describes the wind, but maybe also more than the wind. There's been a spiritual overtone to the wind creating opposition in the entire story. It's at least possible that Peter saw something truly demonic. Now, Paul said, "For we walk by faith, not by sight." That's in 2 Corinthians chapter 5, verse 7. And throughout the Bible, our eyes are the source of trouble. Think about Eve, who saw that the tree was good for food. or David, who saw Bathsheba bathing. Both of those led to disaster. Those stories are in Genesis chapter 3, verses 1 through 7, and 2 Kings chapter 11, verses 2 through 5. Now, the phrase beginning to sink is a little odd in the original language. The word beginning means to be first and was often used in reference to a ruler or leader. And the word sink here means sea. So we can understand that as at once he sank into the sea. But we might also understand that he is being captured by a force that is trying to rule over the sea. And recall we saw earlier that man was to rule over everything, including the sea, from creation in Genesis chapter 1, verse 28. But in reality, Jesus does rule over everything, including the sea. And in either way, Peter's natural response is to cry out for Jesus to save him. Peter doesn't have an absence of faith because he still understands Jesus can save him. It's not the absence, but a weakness of faith. As failure sets in, he still understands his only help will come from Jesus. And we know the world is full of distractions. We have to stay focused on Jesus, not the distractions. Verse 31, Jesus immediately reached out his hand and took hold of him, saying to him, "O you of little faith, why did you doubt?" An already amazing image gets even more remarkable. This is the third use of the word immediately in 11 verses in this story. And recall from our study of Jesus healing the leper in Matthew chapter 8 that the same language was used of Jesus reaching out to touch the leopard as in his taking hold of Peter as he was sinking into the water. It was authoritative and compassionate at the same time. This is a snatching away like we saw earlier in Job. Now, I used to be a lifeguard many years ago, and the number one rule when you get near a person who can't swim and is panicked is don't let them take you down, because their immediate reaction is to try to climb on top of you if they can get their hands on you. Well, Jesus has no such trouble or concern. His feet are firmly planted on the surface of the water. The thing that threatened to be over Peter's head was at the feet of Jesus. It illustrates that we have to lay the things that threaten us at the feet of Jesus in prayer. Paul said, God put all things under his feet, under Jesus' feet. That's in Ephesians chapter 1, verse 22. And speaking of the disciples' little faith, Jesus said, "For truly I say to you, if you have faith like a grain of mustard seed, you will say to this mountain, 'Move from here to there,' and it will move, and nothing will be impossible for you." That's in Matthew chapter 17, verse 20. Now the word doubt here literally means to duplicate and was used in the sense of moving in two different directions or having two different thoughts. And James used a different word, but he said much the same thing when he said of the one who lacks wisdom, "Let him ask in faith, with no doubting, for the one who doubts is like a wave of the sea that is driven and tossed by the wind." And he describes that man as a double-minded man, unstable in all his ways. That's in James chapter 1, verses 5 through 8. And maybe James had this event in mind when he wrote this. Now, we're not told what Peter doubted. It seems like there are at least a few possibilities. He might have doubted in Jesus' ability to remain in control. He could have doubted what his own walking on the water meant. Others suggest he doubted Jesus' original command, which was get into the boat and go before him to the other side. He didn't call them to drown in the water, but to get to the other side. In either event, the storm should cause us to remember the promises of God. Paul said, if we are faithless, he remains faithful. That's in 2 Timothy chapter 2, verse 13. Peter took his eyes off Jesus, but Jesus did not take his eyes off Peter. Verse 32, and when they got into the boat, the wind ceased, and those in the boat worshipped him, saying, "Truly, you are the Son of God." Notice they got in the boat, both Jesus and Peter. Let me ask you a question. How did they get back to the boat to get into the boat? Well, it doesn't tell us Jesus carried him, so they must have walked together. That's a beautiful picture. The word ceased here implies that the wind was tired and spent. Like a tired child, it fell asleep. The psalmist said, Then they cried to the Lord in their trouble, and he delivered them from their distress. He made the storm be still, and the waves of the sea were hushed. Then they were glad that the waters were quiet, and he brought them to their desired haven. Let them thank the Lord for his steadfast love, for his wondrous works to the children of men. That's in Psalm 107, verses 28 through 31. And once again, Mark gives us an important detail that Matthew does not. He records that he, Jesus, got into the boat with them, and the wind ceased. And they were utterly astounded, for they did not understand about the loaves, but their hearts were hardened. That's in Mark chapter 6, verses 51 and 52. They saw an incredible miracle in the feeding of the 5,000, but they didn't understand it. But here they recognize Jesus is the Son of God. Now, this part of the story is also meant to remind us of the flood and the ark. Those in the ark were saved, and we see that it's better to be with Jesus in the storm than any other place. Now, verse 33 is the climax of the story. The climax isn't the walking on the water or the calming of the wind. The climax is that they worship Jesus as God. And this is the first time the disciples used the title Son of God for Jesus. Jesus is all-powerful and can be trusted in all things. He is the king of life's storms. Charles Spurgeon said that faith is like a telescope because it brings Christ nearer to us, and it lets us see him as he is. We have no greater need than to keep our eyes on Jesus. And Brian Bell said, Jesus will send us, he will watch us, he will come to us, he will talk with us, and he will save us. Those are the words of Brian Bell. Now in Matthew chapter 8, Jesus is in a boat in a terrible storm on the same sea. We're told that he rose and rebuked the wind and the sea, and there was a great calm. That's in Matthew chapter 8, verse 26. So he demonstrated his power over creation there as here, both the winds and the sea. And there the disciples expressed amazement, asking, "What sort of man is this, that even winds and the sea obey him?" That was in verse 27. Well, now they know what sort of man this is, and they express worship. And this is not just a demonstration of the deity of Jesus, but it's also a demonstration that they, and you and I sometimes, are slow to learn, and how patient the Lord Jesus is. God knows we learn more in storms and trials than in comfortable settings. Now, one of the greatest events in history is the splitting of the sea that allowed the Israelites to cross through on dry ground in Exodus chapter 14. And we're all familiar with that story, and we're meant to link this story to that one. Both stories speak prominently about the sea, a strong wind, and nighttime. Both speak of the early morning watch and of the Lord watching over his people. In both stories, the people cry out, and the Lord tells them to fear not or to be courageous. And the result of that story was that Israel saw the great power that the Lord used against the Egyptians, so the people feared the Lord, and they believed in the Lord and in his servant Moses. That's in Exodus chapter 14, verse 31. Here, Jesus didn't split the sea because he didn't need to walk on dry ground, proving again that someone greater than Moses is here. And more than just being greater than Moses, Jesus is communicating that he is God. And we've said before that the crossing of the sea by the Israelites is perhaps the most important act of God in the Old Testament, and the providing of salvation is his most important act in the New Testament. Crossing the Red Sea is referenced dozens of times in the Old Testament and symbolizes salvation. And just like he brought his own people safely to the other side in Exodus chapter 14, now he brings his own disciples safely to the other side here. These two stories are linked together and symbolize salvation. We have a clear connection to the creation and healing of demonic activity. And we see Jesus is the greater Moses who was to come. And the disciples realize that Jesus is Emmanuel, God with us. Now, whatever the wind was, Jesus had power over it. And when they crossed over to the other side, we're told that the people there brought to him all who were sick. That's in verse 35. And the word sick here means evil, implying they were sick from evil spirits or demons. We've seen that word before. It adds weight to the thought that this story has a demonic element to it, more than just the natural elements of wind and waves. Okay, well, let's summarize and find application. First, let's take an inventory of the disciples' day. The weather changed on them, which ruined their day. They're working hard, but getting nowhere, and not just for a couple of hours, but all night. And they've had no sleep. Now, right before this, several hours were spent with Jesus' teaching and feeding the 5,000. Now, right before that, they heard that John the Baptist had been killed. And Mark tells us that Jesus said, "Come away by yourselves to a desolate place and rest a while." That was in Mark chapter 6, verse 31. While they are withdrawing to be alone and get some rest, this huge crowd follows them and they get no rest. So let's think about it. They've had an emotionally devastating day, followed by several hours of tending to the care of others. And the ones they were serving started to get overly excited, and so they were excused from what could have turned into a crowd control situation. Let me ask you a question. Have you ever had a day like that? Are you in the fourth watch of the night in a day that was emotionally upsetting to begin with, filled with others who needed something from you, along with the kind of resistance that keeps you from doing something you could almost do in your sleep? And speaking of sleep, you should have been in bed hours ago, and you know what? Then you burned the toast. Let me ask you a question. Are you looking for Jesus when you have a day like that? God wants to use those days to teach us to rely on Him and stop trying to row our own boat. He wants us to understand that things will go more smoothly if we hand the control over to Him. Our storm is more powerful than we are, but it isn't more powerful than Him. It's been said that you're either in the middle of a storm now, coming out of a storm, or entering into a storm. And the storm may be emotional, relational, moral, or financial. And maybe it's related to your health. Jesus said, "I have said these things to you, that in me you may have peace. In the world you will have tribulation, but take heart, I have overcome the world." That's in John chapter 16, verse 33. And one of the promises of God is that He will never leave you nor forsake you. We see that in Hebrews chapter 13, verse 5. Now you might lose sight of Jesus, but Jesus will never, ever lose sight of you. Now second, this isn't just a teachable moment after a series of events happen. The whole scenario was created for a teachable moment to strengthen their faith. And the lesson is that Jesus didn't send them into the storm so they would drown, but so they would look for Him. They aren't in the storm by accident because Jesus sent them there and left them there. They weren't there all night by accident because Jesus was in control of when He would go to them. So even when, or perhaps especially when, Jesus sends us out, we may encounter storms. And not all of our hardships stem from poor choices. Jesus intentionally led His disciples into difficult situations, and at times He may allow us to remain in those difficult times longer than we wish. Lengthy hardships can also be part of God's plan. And there are storms meant for correction and storms meant for purification. Jonah experienced a correcting storm, while the challenges faced by the disciples, and especially Peter, were designed to purify and refine their character. These trials tested their faith and revealed their weaknesses. Let me ask you a question. Can you relate to that? There is nothing in your life or mine that is without a purpose and meaning for us to learn that we can trust in Jesus. God is able to put us in a set of circumstances that we are forced to realize we cannot do. And sometimes we have to be taught what we can't handle to know that He doesn't intend for us to handle it. We sometimes have to be brought to the end of ourselves to receive the help that He offers. Jesus walks in triumph as King of Kings and Lord of Lords, and He has your storm under control. God may or may not change your storm, and if not, He will certainly change your heart. Third, are you frozen with fear and stuck in your boat? There are exactly two people in the history of the world who have walked on water. Peter did something no other human who wasn't the creator of the universe did. And there easily could have been 13. The other 11 disciples robbed themselves of one of the greatest things they would have ever done, but they missed it. Now let me ask you a question. Which part of the story do you tend to focus on? Peter's faith that allowed him to step out with Jesus onto the water, or the fear that caused him to sink? Well, it's been said that one wet Peter is far more impressive than 11 dry disciples. Peter initiated the action, asking Jesus to command him to come, which is a request for Jesus to empower him to come. And all it took for Peter to respond was one word from Jesus: come. Peter obeys in true faith and steps out. He stakes his life on that one word of Jesus: come. It's not possible to do anything significant for God without taking the risk of stepping out in faith. Now, Peter had to believe that Jesus had the power and the authority to grant such a request. Peter's faith in Jesus was such that, if the Lord commands, I can walk on the water. Peter believed Jesus had the power and authority to command me to do something no one has ever done before. That's a bold faith. And he also had a bold willingness to do what Jesus commanded. He was going to be all in one way or the other. He was willing to be all in Jesus' will and risked being all in the sea. And even when that happened, Jesus didn't let him fail. So the question is, do you have a bold faith in what Jesus can do in your life? And do you have the bold willingness to step out in faith as he calls? We never regret the times we obey Jesus, even when things don't work out the way we hoped. But we will regret the times we disobey Jesus. And finally, both Peter's request to command me to come and Jesus' command to come are singular. Can you imagine if Peter asked Jesus to command us to come? Well, it's in the singular, of course, so that it speaks personally to you and to me. And Jesus saves those who understands the futility of their life without him and are about to drown, spiritually speaking, and cry out to him, and he does so immediately. Jesus delivers Peter from his own weakness of faith into the security of life with him. And salvation is like that. It provides the security of life with Jesus for the rest of your life here on earth and for all eternity in heaven. And we've said many times that Jesus has done everything necessary for you to be saved. Like the men in the boat, he will leave you in the futility of your life without him until you come to the point where you recognize you're about to be drowned by the worries of the world. Peter's faith was genuine but incomplete. So you can call out to him today, even if you don't fully understand it. Ella Wheeler Wilcox wrote a poem with the following lines: one ship sails east and another west, by the selfsame winds that blow. 'Tis the set of the sails and not the gales that tells the way we go. Like the winds of the sea are the waves of time as we journey along through life. 'Tis the set of the soul that determines the goal and not the calm or the strife. Your life doesn't have to be swayed by the world's changing winds of what is considered acceptable. You can set your sail to come to Jesus today. And if you'd like to know more about putting your faith in Jesus for the forgiveness of sin, you can reach out to us at the link below. We'd be happy to talk with you more about that. And that's the message of Jesus walking on the water along with Peter. And I look forward to our next time together, should the Lord allow.